Hello, everybody. Back in April of 2022, more than 3 years ago, we did a show with a very distinguished British historian, Richard Overy. At that point, he had a book out, new book. It was called Blood and Ruins, The Last Imperial War. It was about the period just before and during the Second World War. Overy believes that World War II was indeed the last Imperial War. In my conversation with Overy, we discussed whether or not the Second World War had actually ended yet, and given particularly what was happening at that time in the Ukraine and perhaps even in the Middle East, there's a strong argument to suggest that the Second World War still hasn't ended. It certainly hasn't ended for historians of the Second World War, like my guest today, Jochen Hollbeck. He's the author of a number of very well-reviewed, very carefully researched books on the Second World War. Everyone will be familiar, I think, with his book, Stalingrad, The City That Defeated the Third Reich. And he has a new book out on the Second World War. It's out in a couple of weeks on October the 21st. It's entitled World Enemy Number One, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and the Fate of the Jews. Jochen Hollbeck is joining us from Brooklyn, New York. Jochen, congratulations on the new book. So many books have been written, I don't need me to tell you this, on the Second World War. What are the unanswered questions in your view? What is the question, most of all, that hasn't or couldn't be addressed that you're trying to address in World Enemy Number One?
So it seems to me that so many books, especially centering on the Eastern Front, are often written or predominantly written through German eyes. And even though the Soviet Union figures in this quite centrally, these are mostly German specialists who venture into that terrain. And we end up with a very German-centered perspective. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think my contribution, going back to my book on Stalingrad, is to sort of reverse that and enrich the German perspectives with Soviet perspectives so that we actually see both sides in interaction. And I think the eureka moment for me came when I began to become interested in the Second World War as a Soviet specialist. I had been working on diaries, first-person accounts from the Soviet Union from the 1930s, and I was, after concluding this book, Revolution of My Mind, writing a diary under Stalin, which shows how so many people in the Soviet Union actually envisioned their lives not counter to the Soviet state, but really in tandem with the Soviet revolutions. That was kind of the defining horizon for them. And I just thought, how interesting would it be to juxtapose this kind of ideological trajectory coming out of the Soviet Union with the Nazi trajectory, basically compare those two. And I had a conversation with another, a wonderful historian, Omar Bartov, who used to teach at Rutgers before he went on to Brown. And so he was back at Rutgers, and we were sitting there sipping coffee, and I told him about this interest. And I was really thinking more about intellectual history and conceptions of the new person here and the new person there. And then he just interrupted and said, why don't you write about Stalingrad? Stalingrad really as this prolonged encounter between the two sides. And that's exactly how I came to studying the Battle of Stalingrad, which now in retrospect is sort of a stepping stone to this much bigger book about the German-Soviet confrontation going back to the end of the First World War and extending very much into the present. And as I said, the eureka moment came when, as a Soviet specialist, when I began to read very seriously in all the secondary, but also especially the primary sources on Nazi German history, when I saw all these references to Bolshevism, to Soviet communism flashing up, and it didn't stop. And I realized that there is here something defining, a defining fixation of the Nazis that has not been fully mapped by any historian before me, especially not in a through line starting with the founding of the Nazi Party and extending to 1945, but then past 1945 and its permutations in the Cold War and afterwards until the present day.
So the title of the book is World Enemy Number One. The subtitle is Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and the Fate of the Jews. It's interesting. It could have been, I guess, Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, and the fate of the Jews, although you're talking about the Nazis and the Soviets. Is the world enemy number one in your mind? Is it from the Nazi point of view? Is it Soviet Russia or international Jewry, or did or do the Nazis collapse the two? So when they talk about the Soviets, they're really talking about the Jews, and when they talk about the Jews, they were talking about the Soviets.
That's exactly what's going on. And for that reason, I very deliberately used Soviet Russia, and I didn't speak of, say, the Soviet Union. It's not Hitler's Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and the fate of the Jews. In the eyes of the Nazis, world enemy number one, that is their term, denoted the Russians. And the Russians equal the Bolsheviks equals the Jews. So for them, this was just like one continuum. And even when they mentioned the Soviet Union, they always thought of Soviet Russia, except when they, split it up into different nationalities and thought about who could actually be a convenient ally or sort of a helper people. They did differentiate at a time, but most casually, on the casual level, Soviet Union rhymed with Russia and Russia rhymed with Jews. So they believe that Russia was Soviet Russia, I should say, the Russia that emerged in 1917 with the October Revolution, was the most dangerous bastion of world Jewry. So undoubtedly Hitler and other Nazis hated all Jews, but they concentrated their hatred on the politically organized Jews. These are all beliefs objects, so I'm not saying that this is a Jewish ideology, not at all. This is the Nazi thinking, that they believe that the Jews, Karl Marx, who admittedly was the grandson of a rabbi, which is something the Nazis made a lot of, that he had devised a Jewish ideology, meaning communism, for the sake of ruling over and destroying the world. And so that is how they viewed then Lenin and his pupils and everyone else in Soviet Russia as really followers of Marx, as a organized group, heavily armed with the Red Army numbering millions of people, but even more heavily armed due to their ideology. And that was essentially the defining other for the Nazi ideological faith.
But it was obviously delusional. I mean, Lenin wasn't Jewish. Stalin was perhaps the most un-Jewish figure in the 20th century. And the Nazis, Hitler in particular, was so preoccupied with the international threat of Judaism that they made the same remarks, I don't know, about FDR's association with international bankers, or the same as Churchill. So for you as a historian, how you distinguish between ideological obsessions, fantasies, and actuality? Or do you just believe everything? I don't mean believe everything, agree everything. I don't mean when you say you believe everything, you agree with everything that Hitler said, but you just kind of take it as face value.
I mean, I wouldn't say that I take things simply at face value and run with them. I think that would be too simple. However, I think as a historian, one of my primary obligations and basically my primary methodological objectives is to actually to study the language of my historical actors very seriously, and not for a minute waver in this study and somehow establish categories of my own, whether something is rational or irrational, sounds right or is delusional. This is not my job. I need to really follow their thinking and establish its logic and follow that logic. And I do this through a lot of triangulations, also pairing and juxtaposing sources to get a really dense picture. But just to give you perhaps one example of the effects of this delusional thinking. So we are in the year 1928, in July 1928, and Hermann Goering has just made it into the German Weimar era parliament. So he's one of 12 Nazi deputies in the new parliament. This is the first kind of minor breakthrough moment of the Nazi Party. 2 years later, they would jump from like 2.6% of the national vote to, I think, something like 12%, and have like more than 100, no, more than upward of 50 deputies. But he's now in parliament, and his wife, Karin, who's a Swedish-born, writes exuberantly to her mother because she, along with Goering, walks into the Reichstag, the parliament building, and sees all the fellow Nazis and is impressed with them. And then what she's really focusing on are the communist deputies. The Communist Party at that point had many, many more deputies in the Reichstag, and they were also dressed in some sort of uniform. And then she says, this was an incredible sight, a revolting sight. All these communists with their Star of David that they were wearing on their sleeves, by which I mean, and I'm quoting her, by which I mean the Soviet star, this is actually one and the same thing. So she sees communists, she sees the red star, and what she understands is this is the yellow star, this is Jewish rule. So I think this is an extraordinary source because it shows how we need to study propaganda beyond its kind of appellative functions addressed to some unsuspecting people who are then to believe this, to actually seeing how it becomes an object.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point, and it's interesting anecdote, Jochen, but to go from that, the fact that the wife of a senior Nazi associated Soviet officials with Jewish people doesn't necessarily make the argument that
these are not Soviet officials; these are German communist deputies.
Well, German. I mean, I take your point. So, if your thesis is right, and it's a very provocative thesis, and saying it's right or wrong, I think is absurd because clearly there's some truth in it, and these big themed arguments when it comes to world history are often impossible to either completely prove or disprove. But if your thesis is right, why would Hitler have even bothered with the Western Front? I mean, the Soviets weren't popular in Western Europe. The British, the French were hostile to Russia. Maybe even some senses there were anti-Semitic forces there that saw the Bolshevik Revolution in Judaic internationalist terms. Why didn't Hitler do a deal with the West and simply invade the Soviet Union?
Well, I don't think we can reduce Hitler to just a monadic kind of person who has just one simple objective. I mean, he was, after all, a soldier in the First World War, in the Great War, as they called it then, and he was on the Western Front in that war. And he, if you read Mein Kampf, he's filled with rage and venting toward the French. So he clearly is trying to get even with France. And so there's a lot of thinking. There may be also conflicting thoughts in his head about who is an enemy and who not. But on the scale of things, it's absolutely clear that the Soviet Union is sort of the world enemy number one beyond propaganda. That translates into planning. You see this in military planning dating back to the mid-1930s, when they had very serious plans to develop a so-called Ural bomber, a bomber that could actually reach all this heavy industry that Stalin, right at that time, was building up ostensibly beyond the reach of enemy air force. They had plans how to tackle the rail gauge of the Soviet Union. All this goes back to the mid-1930s, complete with propaganda leaflets that they wrote about, in several languages, Russian, Ukrainian, other Soviet languages, addressed to Red Army soldiers, how they should take out the Jewish commissars, the political officers in the Red Army, just beat them to death because those are their oppressors. So there was a very, very elaborate plan underway that I don't think you can just see as opportunistic and sort of or study it along the other planning, because it just took so much oxygen. And in 1939, when Hitler actually went to war against Poland and subsequently against France, he was telling some neutral officials that, if the West is too stupid to understand it, so they may have to accept the consequences. I'm first going to attack them, and then I'm going to attack Russia. It was very clear to him. So I object also to the historiography that sees the Hitler-Stalin Pact as the kind of defining um, event of the war. Two totalitarian um, dictators partitioning the globe. Of course, there's a lot of truth to that, but this is often read in too static a way, as somehow the inception point of the war and the ending point of the war. For me, 1939, the pact had a lot more tactical short-term significance, and both sides absolutely knew that it would soon be broken. Stalin knew about Hitler's designs. He was just hoping that Hitler would get exhausted in the West and no longer be able to attack him at 41, but he also needed the breathing space to arm the Red Army further and to basically prepare the Soviet Union for the war. And Hitler, in turn, conveniently used Soviet raw materials to actually fuel his attacks in the West and in the south of Europe. And starting in July 1940, he had a full year to prepare Barbarossa in earnest. So none of this compares to his planning in other campaigns.
Many books, Jochen, again, you don't need to tell you this, have been written about the moral equivalence of the evil perpetuated by Hitler and Stalin in Russia, in the Soviet Union and Germany. And of course, people like Anne Applebaum have written books suggesting that Stalin might have had more blood on his hands than Hitler. Mm-hmm. Is there a degree of moral, not equivalence? I don't know what the opposite of equivalence is. Are you making a distinction in this book, implicitly at least, between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia? You're not, of course, arguing that Soviet Russia was a force for good, but are you suggesting, to borrow a term from Hannah Arendt, that Nazi Germany was radically evil and Soviet Russia wasn't?
So let me go back to your suggestion for a subtitle, for a different subtitle. You had suggested Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, and the fate of the Jews. And I think I also tried to resist that, because so much of my book features actors a few ranks below Hitler and Stalin. Of course, Hitler and Stalin do figure, and quite centrally, of course, as they need to. But my prime interest is really in reading and sort of decoding the thoughts and the behavior of more ordinary people on the ground, and also the leaders, I would say intellectual leaders, like mid-level leaders, not to reduce them. But
the Eichmanns of the world.
The Eichmanns, but also the Ilya Ehrenburgs, the writers who turned into war propagandists, and whose writings I just find really inspiring, I have to say. I mean, there was recently in the West, in the US, in the UK, and in other parts of the Western world, a real obsession with Vasily Grossman.
Yeah,
I share that obsession. In fact, I give myself credit for his Stalingrad book appearing in English, because I tipped off the translator, Robert Chandler, about the book. He didn't even know it existed. It's the prequel to Life and Fate. And so absolutely, deservedly, Grossman is seen as this outstanding correspondent, but hardly anyone knows much about Ilya Ehrenburg, who in my view is even more significant than Grossman in this war. He was universally recognized as Russia's, or perhaps even the world's, leading war reporter. And so my book on the Soviet side is very centrally concerned with how Ehrenburg comes to understand this war, and how he works not so much or not only as a propagandist, but really as a documentarist of the war. I mean, how he reads the Germans in his editorials, of which more than one appears every day. So he, in toto, writes something like 1,500 editorials in multiple languages, including the New York Times. And every editorial, I mean, not every, but so many of them, begins with a German document that has fallen into his hands, like a diary, a letter, a military order, or several of them. And starting from that reading, he sort of unfolds a picture of the German Nazi mind, and then ends the editorial with a call to fight this wicked enemy. And so many of my colleagues in the field actually thought that I was led to actually give so much credence to Ehrenburg's message because he's a propagandist. And so as a propagandist, he must have invented all of this stuff. He must have made it up. But there are so many records in the archives that show that Ehrenburg did not make up anything. He did take credit. I mean, he took liberties. He of course quoted selectively, as we all do. And so he certainly sharpened his message this way. But I can vouch that there is not a single word that he changed. In fact, there's a few letters have survived of incensed Ilya Ehrenburg writing to the Soviet Center saying, "Why did you falsify a diary that I have just used in a missive, and you're presenting it differently? You should not do that because A, people will not take my editorials seriously anymore, and B, there's absolutely no need to tamper with German documents. They speak for themselves. They discredit themselves." And so this is a line that I take on the Soviet side, and I match it with German letters that I found independently of Ehrenburg. But with those letters and diaries, putting them together, Ehrenburg's selection doesn't look. And so, yes,
I'm not sure about so to come back to the key question I asked you about whether the book suggests that there was something more sort of radically evil about the Nazis than the Soviets, and you gave me a long answer about your use of Ehrenberg's
short sequel to my prior kind of long-winded discourse on sources. Yes, I think there is something that we can call evil, and that comes from just this idea of this absolutely an idea that is unfiltered and excessive of racial suprematism that does not ever question its premises and believes that everything the Germans is not only right but necessary, and they're there in this war of annihilation to actually to serve history, to serve the history of their nation. It's a very unapologetic call for violence that always actually becomes most articulate in a setting of acute perceived danger. So whenever the Germans hear of partisans in their vicinity, this is the mode into which they snap. There are so many stories of good Germans, right? Of Germans who hand out chocolate to the civilian population. There's always a story of a good German, but it is very much context driven. And so when the context change and when German forces in the East find themselves under threat, they invariably come to that extremely lethal, unforgiving diagnosis. And of course, this dynamic then just goes up in 1944, 1945 as the Red Army nears Germany.
Yeah, and I guess kind of...
and you don't same dynamic. You have, of course, a lot of unmitigated violence. You have revenge. You have ghastly crimes on the Red Army side. But you have so many commentators from within the Red Army, ordinary soldiers, officers, spectators, like journalists, who condemn these actions. And this is not something you find on the German side. You're not going to find this tapestry of moral criticism. You had it in part prior to Barbarossa and the Polish campaign. There were more voices condemning these kind of actions, the crimes of the SS.
And to remind everyone, Operation Barbarossa was the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Some people might be listening to this, Jochen, and perhaps hear a little bit of apologetics for the Soviet Union. You could argue, for example, that the Soviets always seem to be at war ever since Stalin came to power. Class war, paranoia war within the Bolshevik party, murdered most of the Bolsheviks in the 1930s. Millions of peasants died indirectly or directly as a consequence of his action. How do you distinguish between, shall we say, the Soviet Union of war and the Soviet Union of peace? In a way, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union was the best thing that ever happened to Stalin. He had a a moment to reinvent himself, redefine himself, reattach himself to the Russian or Soviet people. So what about all the terrible crimes? And I don't want to degenerate into some sort of, oh, well, Stalin killed X million and Hitler killed XY million. But what about all the criminality of the pre-war age in the Soviet Union?
So I think a very good way to tackle this question is to sort of look at the life trajectories of people, Soviet people who lived under Stalin or nearly died under Stalin, who were imprisoned under Stalin in the 1930s, and then came to see the German invaders. And there's a good many of them. And I actually have a whole chapter devoted to people like that, who actually in the first hours of the German attack, or especially when the Germans were approaching their home cities, they did not evacuate. Some didn't even have a chance to evacuate because the Soviets picked their own, they cherry-picked the people they deemed most valuable for the war effort. So party functionaries came first and their families, but also people who were working in the most vital war related factories. They were all evacuated, all the factories put on rails, and many stayed behind. Some of them actually stayed behind because they didn't want to give up their houses and because they thought the Germans cannot possibly be worse than the Soviets, and they're likely going to be softer and better rulers. They remembered, those in Ukraine remembered the Germans from 1918 as harsh, but also fair. And they remembered that bread prices under German rule hadn't gone up. And so they expected the Germans with a degree of hope, but these hopes and expectations were so quickly disabused. And soon you see in diaries that some of these people kept under the occupation power, that they start like comparing the regimes and come in the end to side quite emphatically and quite consciously with the Soviets, by basically saying, this is our, not the Reds as they called them initially, but these are our people. These are our boys who are coming back, who we want back. This is our Air Force that's bombing us now. And the defining distinction was not necessarily the overall body count of violence. Soviet people, Soviet citizens knew enough about, the famine, about all the various oppressions that had sort of defined the Soviet era. It wasn't the quantity, it was the quality. It was, I would say, the absolutely spectacular display of violence that the Germans used to intimidate and shock people. So the public hangings, leaving people hanging in public for weeks to deter, to hang them in the most bestial form. Some people said they were hanging them like fish, just hanging them up by their jaws so they would not suffocate but scream for days. It was this debasing violence that turned so many away from the Germans. But below that, and just much more universally, this daily humiliation. And here we come back to the racial supremacy, the sense that the Germans conveyed to most everyone living under their rule that they didn't count for anything, that they were not people. And so that makes people actually take seriously some of the goals of the Soviet Revolution. I think that deserves a serious reading, that somehow, if you think about what people had read, the deportees to Germany, they were interviewed about their fate, and they said, well, we were basically sold like slaves on the market. People were assessing us, opening our mouths, checking out our health. It was like Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so Beecher Stowe and other authors, they were all sort of in the Soviet libraries. And this is essentially one way in which people then appraised the Germans through a quite distinctly Soviet lens, without them being communist in the least.
Your book's it's coming out in a couple of weeks, but it's already getting a lot of attention. Got a very interesting review, a dual review, and an old friend of the show, Ian Buruma, in the New Yorker on the uses and abuses of anti-Semitism. It was reviewed in parallel with a new book by Mark Mazower, your fellow historian at Columbia University, a book that's entitled On Anti-Semitism, A Word in History. Baruma seems to suggest that you and Mizawa have a different take on the history of anti-Semitism. Baruma suggests that Mizawa is Arendtian. Hannah Arendt, of course, most famously wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem, also The Origins of Totalitarianism, in which she presents anti-Semitism as a consequence of modernity. And I think I was rereading Eichmann in Jerusalem recently. She suggests that in Eichmann in Jerusalem, that the plan was once the Nazis killed all the Jews, they would start killing all the Poles and then go on with Slavs and Gypsies and other under races. Are you, in your book, Jochen, suggesting a different argument from Arendt or Mizawa, that modern anti-Semitism, or certainly Nazi anti-Semitism, Holocaust anti-Semitism, was different from just being a consequence of modernity, and that anyone could be Jews, Poles, Hungarians, Romanians, that there was something somehow special about the Jews from the Nazi point of view?
I would not essentially establish these kind of clear-cut blocks of thinking and say I oppose that and I advocate that, because there's just so much flux. I would stress the anti-Enlightenment orientation of the Nazis. Essentially, the Nazis targeting the Enlightenment, the ideas of 1789, as the central moment when the world sort of came off course by preaching a egalitarian society in which crucial distinctions, crucial hierarchies got lost that are so important for the Nazis. And as far as the communists are concerned, and those really are, you know, at the fulcrum of my study, and I think this is the distinction. I think anti-communism is just so often missing in books on anti-Semitism. So there are books on, you know, the Jewish enemy that actually list all the enemy propaganda that the Germans came up with, where they portrayed Jews as Jews. But so often the anti-Bolshevik propaganda, which was huge, is missing from that, because Bolsheviks are not often explicitly mapped as Jews, but they were understood to be Jews, just like Karin Goering saw the Reichstag deputies and understood they were Jewish. So I want to bring in this anti-communist vector and communism in Hitler's eyes, as he said it very clearly in 1936. The communist project is essentially the most radical offspring of the Enlightenment, and we have to destroy that. I mean, this is essentially the pivotal battle. And so, and all of that is Jewish. So, but I want to basically put more of an emphasis on communism or an anti-communism, because it's just been so often missing in scholarship. There was one precious book written many years ago by Arno Mayer, Why Did the Heavens Not Darken, that actually lays this out. But Mayer, I think, committed some mistakes in his reading. He severed communists from Jews and said basically after their inability to destroy the communist Soviet Union, the Nazis vented their anger on the Jews, and that makes no sense to me, because the attack was always an integrated attack on Jew communists. And secondly, he also dispensed with footnotes, and that didn't make his book kind of more credible, even though it was a very learned book.
What about anti-Semitic communists? I mean, Stalin wasn't very keen on the Jews. There was, of course, the Jewish doctor plot after the Second World War. I'm not suggesting that Stalin wanted, like Hitler, to kill all the Jews, but wasn't there a strong element of anti-Semitism within some aspects of Bolshevism, of Soviet communism?
I would say no. I mean, we have to really look very carefully at the chronology. The Soviet state, the Nazis actually told everyone that the Soviet state is philo-Semitic, because there were, demonstrably, there were laws in the Russian Federation, in the criminal code, basically condoning, forbidding hate speech, prosecuting people for hate speech, which was understood as anti-Jewish speech or actions. But it was, any ethnic minority, anyone who vented on an ethnic minority was threatened with a prison term in the early Soviet Union. And so the state actually undertook a lot of efforts to combat popular anti-Semitism early on in the Soviet Union. We have to sort of remember that the Soviet Union or Soviet Russia went through a civil war in which thousands of pogroms had been staged, and I think something like 200,000 Jews died. And so there was a lot of popular anti-Semitism in Russia and in the territories that the Soviet Union inherited. The state policy was always one of sort of thinking in terms of an architecture of the different republics, the different ethnicities, and multiracial friendship and integration. And Jews, to some extent, epitomized the ideal of the Soviet state. The historian Yuri Slyoskin has written about this beautifully. He basically describes them as the most Russian of all people because they speak Russian, they identify with the Russian language. The secular Jews no longer spoke Yiddish. They did not speak Hebrew. They had forsworn their faith, the Jewish religion, and they had no homeland other than the Soviet Union or Soviet Russia. And to that extent, they were ideal Soviet subjects. And for that reason, too, so many Jews served in Soviet official functions. This changes after the war, once more and more Soviet Jews begin to understand the extent of the tragedy that had befallen them specifically, that there was in fact a Nazi project to exterminate all Jews. And that gives birth, among many, to a new consciousness that you could basically call a proto-Zionist consciousness. And it is this consciousness that Stalin indicts and vilifies. But this is a matter of chronology, and it doesn't start until 1945.
Implicit in the arguments you're making, it perhaps some people might think, is the idea that the Soviet Revolution then was an Enlightenment project. Do you believe that?
Yes, by all means. I mean, it depends on who you're speaking. I mean, if you essentially say,
let's leave Stalin aside, because I don't think anyone would argue Stalin was enlightened.
But I believe there is a residue. You have to sort of think of the Soviet Revolution as a sort of reservoir of meanings that formed in 1917 that was undoubtedly, I mean, and clearly filled with so many individual hopes and stories of despair and remembered oppression. Serfdom had been lifted only less than a lifetime before. So all of that, of course, needs to be taken seriously. And it's interesting to see in the course of Soviet history how some of this comes back and is refreshed with new meaning. And I think that the moment the Nazis were defeated by the Red Army in 1940, 41, it starts the Battle of Moscow, all the way to 1944, when the Soviet Union then crosses into Poland. This can be called a liberation campaign. Of course, with care, you have to be very careful, because clearly people in Western Ukraine, people in the Baltics were not liberated. They were anything but liberated. They were reoccupied. And not everyone in these other territories felt liberated either. It depended on what
mildly
they had done. Exactly. And so you have to differentiate. You cannot paint with a broad brush, but to basically disavow this whole reservoir of meanings, the Soviet Revolution, I think, is to make a big mistake.
Can't you also find idealism within the Nazi movement? I mean, there were early Nazis who believed in the land. They were romantic. They didn't like the Jews, but they believed in the ideal, the promise of German culture and all the rest of it. You can always find, you talk about good Germans. I guess I'm not sure if you can find a good Nazi, but you can certainly find Nazis who weren't profoundly evil.
You can find actually a good amount of Germans on the Eastern Front, although I was not able to study them closely. But, a writer comes to mind, a future writer comes to mind, Heinrich Böll, who kept diaries on the Eastern Front. There are other, very outspoken, eloquent, cultured, cultivated Germans who likewise kept diaries and really often also empathized with ordinary Russians or Ukrainians. All of that is true. But I think at some point, we have to sort of take stock of the magnitude of the crimes that took place and that were committed by not just the SS, and the Gestapo and the field police, but by ordinary German soldiers. And we have to really confront that and ask ourselves, how is that possible, rather than sort of working on the margins and picking the few good Germans. And I think that has often been sidestepped. And I think one reason why it has been sidestepped is that Soviet sources have been just believed to be made up. And so if you bring Ehrenburg, and then if you essentially map up German diaries and records, personal records, with what Ehrenburg writes about them, there is a congruence that I want readers to see.
And of course, those monstrous crimes you deal with in great detail in your book. It's a massive book, highly researched. One of the events you describe in terrible detail is Babi Yar. Perhaps very briefly, Joachim, you might explain what happened at Babi Yar and why it's one of the arguments you use in your book about world enemy number one.
Yeah, so Babi Yar is a tragedy that took place or a mass crime that took place in late September 1941, 10 days after the Germans entered Kiev. Babi Yar is a ravine in the north, on the northern outskirts of Kiev. The Germans had taken Kiev. Kiev was pretty much taken as an open city. The Soviet defense had really not worked well. They had retreated and left the city to the Germans. The Germans take possession of the city. And then a few days into the occupation, buildings blow up. Hotels, office buildings, the most imposing buildings in the city center, in which the German generals and officer corps had lodged. And so dozens of German soldiers and officers die in these explosions. And the explosions had actually been coordinated by sabotage fighters working in the city, and coordinated them. They were coordinated with sort of remote detonators from the other side of the river. And what is so striking is that when these explosions happened, the immediate consensus among the Germans was this was the work of the Jews. And so that motivated them then to draft decrees that all of Kiev's Jews — Kiev was a huge, was it not only a big city, but it had something like 200,000 Jewish inhabitants before the German invasion. And the Germans were hoping to actually get 50,000 Jews into their dragnet. In the end, they collected something like 33,700 by their own counting, under sort of this delusional or this deceptive idea that they would be evacuated. They should take their possessions and show up at an intersection where they were greeted then with German shepherds and armed soldiers, and then put through a cordon into this ravine and all shot to death. So it is one, but not the only such action. When the Germans took Kharkiv, back then called Kharkov, in eastern Ukraine, the same thing happens. There were explosions followed by recommendations against Jews. And then the same thing happened also in Odessa. But serially, the Germans made the same, or the Romanians in the case of Odessa, they made the same reflexive association in their heads. These are Jews and we must kill the Jews.
Yeah, and Arendt in Eichmann in Jerusalem argues that the Romanians behaved even more appallingly towards the Jews than the Nazis, which was quite an achievement. Let's go back to where we started, Joachim. Richard Overy and I 3 years ago talked about whether or not the Second World War has ended yet. And given that the two major conflicts in the world are both, in weird ways, next chapters out of the Second World War, the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in Israel, Gaza. Let's end on that question. For you as a historian, has this, I mean, you obviously have done all your research. You've got a very, very compelling thesis in World Enemy Number One. So it hasn't ended in historiographical terms, but in world historical terms. Has the Second World War ended yet? Are we still living in the wake of it? I mean, of course, the Second World War was a consequence of the First World War and so on and so forth. But are these modern problems like Ukraine and Gaza, Israel, are they direct consequences of the Second World War? You gave an interesting interview back in 2014 to Rutgers, your university, suggesting that Russia is not totally evil. I'm not sure whether you still believe that.
Well, this was a headline that I did not write, but yeah. So in response to your question, the big question, the Second World War has definitely ended. And I actually see it differently from Richard Overy, whose book I like very much. But in his book, the First World War and the Second World War are bound together as these wars of empires, of large empires battling it out competitively for influence and geostrategic rivalry. I see that. I see a very strong conclusion, of course, which is not to say that this rivalry doesn't come up again and again in the aftermath of the war, but there's such a strong sense of closure in 1945 that I think we as historians need to respect. I mean, there was such a thing as the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg and Tokyo that essentially settled the war. And I think what's so interesting is to really see present day references to these settlements and their implications rather than to the war. So we're really dealing with a memory culture that is situated in the aftermath of the war, and in no way does this war flare up again, because the war was so universally recognized as outsized and very, very special in a way, as exceptional, that I think it also doesn't help much to compare present day wars, contained as they are, to this absolutely excessive, boundless war that I describe in my book. This said, there are so many ways in which political actors today invoke the war to suggest that it is still this kind of living being and somehow it is with us. And I think that also needs to be analyzed. And the contribution you referenced about Russia and Ukraine in 2014 essentially came out of my own ethnography in Ukraine. I went to Ukraine early in 2014, right after the Maidan revolution, to look into how Ukrainians commemorate the Second World War. And I found really interesting differences that Ukrainians in the Western territories, especially in Lviv, they like then to put May 8, sort of a European memory day, at the center of their commemorations. And they also invoked all the suffering under Soviet rule. And when you went further east to Kiev, to Odessa, Kharkiv, and Donetsk, you saw a very, very different kind of cult of the Great Patriotic War in the Soviet tradition. And I saw a country that is strongly divided back then in terms of its memory culture. So many of these divisions have now been folded because of Russia's politics of aggression, especially with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, that, basically most Ukrainians are now fervent Ukrainian nationalists. But clearly, the different memories of the war did play into the fractured political landscape in Ukraine, and especially the political and then also military divisions between Russia and Ukraine. And for that reason, I think the memory of the war could be seen had a strong inflammatory function for the present war. And I think in order for us to sort of think about ways how to step out of the war, I think this memory does play a continued role.
Yeah, and let me end with a question on memory. In the promotional material for the book, and I'm quoting here, you probably didn't write this, but your publisher says, in the West, World War II is commonly understood as the Allies' struggle against Nazism. Often elided, if not simply forgotten, is the Soviet Union's crucial role in that fight. Is that really true, Jochen? Do you think that the majority of people in the West believe that the Russians didn't play much of a part in the defeat of Nazism?
I agree with you, Andrew. These were not my words. I think as a historian, I could not fully subscribe to that, because there's like kilometers of books on the Eastern Front in so many libraries. But I think what you can still say is, and that comes close to the message on the jacket of the book, is that the Soviet Union is seen as this unseemly ally in a moral coalition. So the allies are really, if we talk about the allies, we really mean the Western allies, and somehow the Soviet Union is not seen as a true ally. And I think that is a mistake. The Soviet Union was a core ally, and throughout the course of the war, especially first turning point, Stalingrad, and starting with Stalingrad all the way to the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union, Soviet soldiers, Soviet civilians who actually toured so many Western countries at the time were understood to be basically representing the gold standard of fighting Nazism. And I think we need to go back to these perspectives to sort of understand the war more fully, what it was. This is what historians do. We have to delve into that and sort of think of it irrespective of what came before and what happened afterwards. We have to recreate the history as it
well,
unfolded.
there you have it, the gold standard of historians. I think Jochen Hollbeck, who teaches at Rutgers, very distinguished historian, is part of that gold standard. His new book, it's out in a couple of weeks, World Enemy #1, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and the Fate of the Jews. A most important book, uncovering stuff that most of us would rather not know about, but stuff that happened. Thank you so much, Jochen, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you, Andrew. It was such a pleasure speaking with you.